Thank you, Chris. I'll start off by talking about when we first started seeing pasture dieback in New South Wales. Then I'll hand over to Nathan, who's been out in the paddock, and he'll talk a little bit about what he's been seeing. Okay, so 2019 is when we had our first reported case in the autumn. So we went out to that property, we took samples and had a bit of a look, but we couldn't really determine what was causing the plants to die. And I'm sure you're all aware 2019 was very dry, so we couldn't just rule out dry drought conditions as causing plant death. We were expecting to see dieback in the north of the state, particularly in the northwest and on the north coast, but we suspect that drought was really masking the symptoms of dieback. Can we move forward to the next slide, please? So moving forward to 2020, there was some really good rain received on the north coast February, March. And following that rainfall, pastures started growing and people started to notice areas that weren't responding well to the rain. And in March, we had our first confirmed case of pasture dieback on the north coast. Since then, we've received multiple reports of dieback. The focused area has mostly been in the Tweed Valley region, but we are encouraging people right across New South Wales, particularly in the north, to be on the lookout for dieback, particularly following rain, and especially if you've got summer growing tropical species that are known to be affected by the condition. So now I'll hand over to Nathan from North Coast LLS, who's been assisting us by going and visiting some of these properties and taking samples, and he's going to talk a little bit about what he's been seeing.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. If we could just have the next slide brought over, please. So as Sarah's already mentioned, we most likely have pasture dieback present in the greatest reports in the Tweed Valley region. A lot of producers have been basically reporting patches of sick grass areas, particularly with their older leaves on the plant turning anything from a yellow, red through to purple, starting from the tip down, and then obviously followed by those large dead areas. And the invasion of broadleaf weeds, in particular farmers' friends, cottonbush, tobacco bush fireweed, but also we're seeing legumes in those areas, the likes of creeping vigna and winged cassia. Yeah, it all seemed to really ramp up following good reports of rain. Most of the sampled properties I've been to have experienced in the vicinity of 1,000 mil of rain since January 2020 through to the end of March. Patches all started relatively small, anywhere from that 5 to 50 square metres. A lot of the properties I sampled, that has now spread. So from their reported time of February through to sampling a few weeks ago to 5 hectares or more. One property reporting 30 hectares completely dead at the moment, which was quite concerning to see. A common theme from the sampled properties I've been to is that as Stuart alluded to, the dieback all started in high pasture biomass areas, which was quite frustrating for those producers who had or were spelling paddocks following the drought conditions last year. That's often where they first noticed these patches dying, starting near fence lines. Another common theme in the Tweed is people said that it seemed to start near trees or shade lines and progress out from there. I think if we move to the next slide, a reason for that may in fact be that one of the most common species we're getting reports of the dieback condition in is actually broadleaf paspalum. You can see a picture there of typically healthy broadleaf paspalum at the top, followed by the symptomatic classic yellow reddening through to purpling of the leaves. Now, many of you will be familiar, but for those who aren't, broadleaf paspalum is very common in the Tweed Valley in and around shade areas. It's not all readily grazed by cattle typically, so it tends to build up quite a biomass, so possibly extending its likelihood to be infected. Next most common grass we're seeing is Bahia grass. Now this could coincidentally be just because it was in high population on these properties that have made the reports to us. You can see the photo there, healthy Bahia grass versus the symptomatic Bahia grass on the right hand side. Also seeing symptoms expressed fairly heavily in giant Paspalum. Now if we could move to the next slide please. A lot of people will be saying, well, what is the matter with, seeing broadleaf Paspalum Bahia grass, giant Paspalum becoming infected? Well, look, the thing is, unfortunately, we are seeing it in our more productive beef grazing pastures. I've just listed them in basically the most likely affected or first seen showing symptoms so far. I've been to one property, you can see, or a couple of properties, but one there in particular, Soteria. The cultivar on that property was Kazangula. It was a fairly old stand. You can note the photos there. There's the classic dieback. You can see the dead pasture invaded by some cotton bush, farmers' friends. If you look across toward the top of the photo, you can see healthy Soteria. The symptomatic plants moving toward out to healthy Soteria. The two other photos there show a classic symptomatic Soteria plant, and then the bottom right shows a Soteria plant from the edge of the dieback line, so showing those real yellow through to purpling of the leaves. That plant was about dinner plate size and was able to be pulled out with one hand. So, typically a Soteria plant in a mature pasture stand is, stalls a slasher, not readily able to be knocked over with minimal force. Look, road grass, also seen properties with road grass showing symptoms. The cultivar at that property was Catambora. Now, look, just because I've listed the two cultivars of, road grass and Soteria that have been affected, I don't suspect that any of the newer cultivars are likely to be any more resistant, or we won't see symptoms in them. It's just the properties that had the dieback in these actually had records as to what the cultivars were. Other grasses showing symptoms, couch, kikuyu, and carpet grass. Again, that's just off the properties that have made reports. There's, could potentially be in some other grasses I haven't yet listed. If we can move to the next slide, please. So what we are seeing this year that isn't pasture dieback, particularly in kikuyu pastures, kikuyu rundown, very common, especially properties that may have once been dairy land and transitioned into smaller lifestyle blocks or beef properties. Basically just, several years of low fertility. The pasture just becomes weak. Other grasses begin to invade those areas. Kikuyu yellows and black spot are both common and known fungal diseases on the New South Wales North Coast. Black spot, you can see a photo there on the left-hand side, basically starts at the tip of the leaves, but you'll see the yellowing through to and with little black lesions on the leaf. You can often find if cattle move through those areas or vehicles drive through those areas, you'll see the tendency for that infection to spread out. Kikuyu yellows, on the other hand, that could quite easily, in some cases, be confused for pasture dieback. The easiest way to distinguish that is that if it's a fairly consistent kikuyu pasture and you're seeing the dieback or the kikuyu appearing to die back, as in the right hand photo there, other grass species will generally invade, particularly annual grasses such as crow's foot and alike, and they will remain quite healthy in those areas. We can obviously test to determine if kikuyu yellows is is present. The next slide, please. This year we are also seeing a lot of common armyworm damage. Again, this is quite usual for the North Coast. However, many are saying that this year, 2020 is the worst they've been in a long time. We're seeing Kikuyu, Soteria, Paspalum, a lot of our early planted winter, ryegrass, oats and the like, having experienced varying degrees of damage. You can see a picture there to the right. That was some oats and chicory oversown through Soteria. You can see, the patches that have been lost from armyworm in that case. Easiest way to distinguish this from pasture dieback is generally there's no discoloration of the leaves. The root systems, especially more mature plants, are quite sound. Still, the plants are quite robust. You can, of course, often find caterpillars and partly eaten leaves or mature plants. Next slide, please. One thing that we have found at every property that I've taken samples from so far, the pasture mealybug that as of late yesterday afternoon, we get the identification as being the Heliococcus near Somervillii, effectively the same mealybug species that Stuart mentioned has been associated with the dieback areas in Queensland. They're in their highest numbers in and around the symptomatic areas, in particularly what we call the dieback line, so the patch between where the grasses are obviously dead and transitioning towards more healthy grass. Move about 4 to 6 metres from that dieback line where plants may not yet be showing symptoms, still being found in reasonable populations there. Move about 50 metres or more outside or away from the dieback line, much lower numbers, if any at all. Now, it could, of course, be the case that they haven't made it there, or, underground, not quite sure. But it's hard not to try and draw a direct link, given we are finding a lot of these guys there. But as you've heard from Stuart earlier, in Queensland, they've had these dieback areas where no mealybugs have been found. But at the moment, we definitely have been finding them at all the infected sites on the Tweed. And that's all from me. Thanks. Back to you, Chris.